So one of the really great things about, so students who may in the future have me as their grad seminar coordinator, facilitator, one of the things that I really, really like, and I should have told the students this year, because, well, actually they all sort of did it in various ways, but the best kinds of questions are the most frightening kinds of questions. They really are. I mean, why study something you're comfortable with? To me, that's a waste of good research time, good brain time, and waste of an audience. So don't do something that's easy. Do something that challenges you. So, I don't know how long ago Shirley talked to me about the challenges of team ministry. And years ago, before it was even a grad project, because she could see herself in that vocation, or that she'd live out her vocation in that world. For the next hour, we're going to be with Shirley Carras as she explores something that she started off with, anticipating a degree of fear and anxiety. Best kinds of questions. Shirley's going to take us through that. Shirley, we're in your hands.
Thank you, Jody. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So do you remember your first experience with teams? I sure do. All I can say is that lining up against the old fence in the field that backed onto our houses and hoping not to be the last one picked for the scrub baseball game was never really high on my fun things to do. But then, as an adult, I expect many of us have probably experienced working in teams, in either a volunteer or a work-related capacity. Maybe we didn't call them teams, maybe it was a working group or a task group, or the best of all, committees. But teams they were nonetheless. So for me, my experience is those teams were often deliberately structured to come up with some sort of deliverable or to problem solve something. 2 heads are better than 1 was the operating adage. But an even stronger conviction was that the whole would be greater than the sum of the parts. And while the team may have met with success, my teaming experience itself was another thing entirely. Some experiences were great, and yet many fell short of that, sometimes by a little, sometimes by quite a lot. So I've been wondering about ministry teams, wondering about them for some time. Were their experiences anything like my previous encounters with teaming? Were their experiences great, just so-so, or were they disastrous? Ministry teams have a strong theological underpinning. The imagery that's evoked in chapter 12 of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians seems to resonate very well with team ministry. Imagery of a variety of spiritual gifts, imagery of the body of Christ, many members and one body. In fact, Paul uses the same imagery again and again in his letters. Romans chapter 12 and Ephesians chapter 4 are notable. Paul's imagery consistently refers to a variety of spiritual gifts that are given to us through God's grace. And just as the various body parts form part of our physical bodies, all of these spiritual gifts form part of the body of Christ, the church. In the 4th chapter of his letter to Ephesians, Paul further expands upon the imagery to say that all the body parts are needed for the proper functioning of the body. It's not simply that the body has unique body parts and that all of the parts fit together and form one body. It's that all of the parts are necessary. Excuse me. So not only do we have our own unique spiritual gifts, but all of our gifts have to work together in order for the body of Christ, the church, to function at its best. This was the same message that St. Augustine delivered in his Pentecost sermon way back in 412. All spiritual gifts, all people were necessary for the proper functioning of the church. But over and above that, Augustine pointed out that remaining connected, being one in the Spirit, was crucial for the individual's own spiritual well-being. Authors who have written about team ministry favor this theological imagery as well. Stephen Machia refers to the image of the body of Christ as the ultimate team, which is first and foremost a unified working structure, and which secondly embraces the 5 key management traits: trust, empowerment, assimilation, management, and service that are crucial to healthy and successful teams. Author George Barna suggests that the Bible endorses the value and significance of team-based leadership, and he points to Moses as an example in the Old Testament. Moses worked with his brother Aaron, using Aaron's complementary abilities, his ability to speak. And later in Exodus, we see another kind of teamwork with Moses, sharing the workload. Moses' father-in-law Jethro suggested that Moses will wear himself out because the task is too much for him alone. And of course, turning to the New Testament, Paul epitomizes teamwork. Barna calls him the quintessential team player, ministering and working with many. So, armed with my own personal experience in teaming, with the big biblical imagery of teamwork and with the opinions of different authors, I set out to delve into the lived experience of ministry teams. I chose to focus my research on team ministry in a single-point pastoral charge or parish, where the team was comprised of at least 2 ordained clergy, each of whom were actively involved in ministry at least 50% of their time, and where each of the team members had a graduate-level theological education, for example, an MDiv. I explored this research topic using a case study approach while drawing on some of the principles of ethnography. My intent was to gain an in-depth appreciation of how my study participants might work together in team ministry. Case study methodology provided me with an opportunity to collect and analyze multiple forms of data for description, themes, and lessons learned about a system of people working and bounded together. Drawing on the principles of ethnography enabled me to be immersed in the language, behaviors, and beliefs of the group while collecting information through observation. I wanted to examine team ministry in 2 sites, which might offer different perspectives. Turning my research into a multi-point case study, Creswell refers to this as purposeful maximal sampling. Therefore, in consultation with my project advisors, I chose potential sites from 2 different mainline Christian denominations in order to give a greater breadth to my research. So for ease of reference, I'm going to refer to each of those single-point pastoral charges or sites as churches. The ministry team in each of the 2 churches selected was comprised of 2 clergy who met the criteria that I was interested in observing. Again, for ease of reference, I'm going to refer to my participants as pastors. So let me introduce pastors green, blue, red, and brown, because that's the color of the text that I used when I transcribed their interviews. All 4 pastors had been ordained for a minimum of 8 years. 3 of the 4 had previous experiences in team ministry prior to their current teaming situation. And the 4th pastor was able to draw on their extensive experience working in a team environment outside the church structure. In their words, I sometimes think that I've run an almost parallel career in a different milieu. I conducted one-on-one interviews with each of the pastors in their church offices, and in addition, I attended liturgies at both churches and observed liturgical styles and practices and the interactions between the teammates and the congregations. These observations also form part of my analysis. The research question that I explored through my interviews and observations was the following: How do ordained clergy understand and live out their vocational calling in a team ministry setting? Robert Yin suggests that the essence of a case study is that it tries to illuminate an issue using what and how questions. So the questions I posed focused on what drew them to team ministry, how they described their experiences, and how teaming meshed with their own vocational identity, particularly with their own theology and with their liturgical and pastoral practices. And although I'm somewhat hesitant to admit this, I did have some preconceived notions about what the data might reveal. Not biases per se, but perhaps an expectation of what they might talk about. And well, so much for that. So what I experienced instead were these glorious conversations, ripe with experiences, anecdotes, and emotions that were so real and so captivating that I'm excited to be able to present the highlights of the data to you. My participants were also strongly vested in this model of ministry, that their reflections took into account not only their current experience in teaming, but also their past exposures to team ministry. Their unanimous overall experience of team ministry deserves to stand alone, I think, and be acknowledged. Pastor Blue said, "It's amazing. It almost feels like a family." Pastor Red said, "Teaming is a wonderful, wonderful experience." Pastor Green added, "It's just been a delight all the way around." And Pastor Brown said, "Oh, absolutely, team ministry is better." So within that context, I identified three main themes. First, what made their team ministry experience so wonderful, so amazing? What were some of the challenges that they experienced within team ministry? And thirdly, what were some of the key success factors? So first, why so wonderful? Why so amazing? Why so delightful? I heard that it was a relief to work in team ministry. It lessened the load. Carrying the burden alone can be stressful. Remember back to Jethro's warning to Moses, and it can be lonely. Author H.B. London, who is also a pastor, says loneliness troubles many pastors. It's just like a chronic virus, because so much of a pastor's work is done alone, behind closed doors, so to speak. Loneliness becomes an occupational hazard. Other things also contribute to this sense of loneliness. Things like trying to maintain a professional distance, being removed from classmates and other peers who previously provided support to you, and of course, having to maintain strict confidentiality. Clinical psychologists suggest it's not surprising that clergy often find themselves exhausted, depleted, and languishing in the throes of burnout. Research has shown that there's an inverse correlation between support and burnout. The less the support, the greater the levels of burnout, and vice versa. My participants all spoke about the opportunities teaming provides for mutual support. Support that helped combat this feeling of being overwhelmed, this sense of loneliness. Support that spelled relief. Pastor Green said, recognizing that I don't have to do everything, that's a big thing. Pastor Brown told me just the knowledge that you're not in this up to your eyeballs all on your own. That there is someone, even someone you can sit down over a coffee with and share what's going on. To be able to do that in-house and to be able to do that with a degree of comfort and confidentiality, that's a huge piece. I observed an interaction between two of the pastors, and it had occurred immediately after one of them had had a particularly difficult pastoral encounter in the church offices. Without asking, the other asked my participant, "Do you want to debrief later?" A listening ear offered and accepted. Support also came in the way of what I might call back and filling. Whether it was an unplanned, stressful, or busy personal time, or whether it was a planned vacation, the team would step up. One of my participants spoke of being able to take vacation time, saying, "So to be able to have the trust and that you can walk away for a week knowing that everything is in good hands." I mean, that's huge. I heard that team ministry gave them a sense of freedom to pursue their own passions and interests and to build upon their strengths. Referring to a previous experience in team ministry, Pastor Brown told me it was quite easy for us to identify the areas of interest and the areas of strength and say, well, okay, you do this piece and I'll do this piece. And we kind of identified where our particular strengths and interests lay. And in doing that, we're able to do those bits and pieces with a fair bit of enthusiasm and passion. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Because that's what we were really excited to do. Team ministry also provided the opportunity to expand upon particular interests. One of my participants was telling me about their pastoral outreach and how it started with one service and one facility, and then it expanded, and then it expanded again. Having the freedom to pursue and to build upon those interests was both personally gratifying and was missional from the perspective of the church. Several pastors spoke freely of sharing ideas with one another, of brainstorming, and of trying out their creativity. One said, I think sharing ideas that, oh, I hadn't thought of that, or, that would be a good way of doing that, or, no, I really think we should do it this way, because it worked for me. Another told me how great it was to be able to approach their colleagues and say, colleagues, I haven't got a clue what to do in this situation. What are we going to do about this? And I observed and listened to how they lived out their own personal theologies and how they nurtured their liturgical and pastoral identities. One of the surprises for me, although perhaps it really shouldn't have been a surprise, was that my participants weren't really so much shaped by team ministry as their team ministry was shaped by how they lived out their vocational calling themselves. Team ministry was simply an expression of themselves, of their own identities. Authors Irvin Hinkleman and Stephen Carter suggested that each team member needs to find his or her own personal inner spiritual and emotional strength. My observations were that my participants lived this out. The personal theologies of my participants aligned very closely both with the biblical imagery of team ministry, one body, varying spiritual gifts, all for the common good, and also with each other's theologies. Listen to those connections. Pastor Green shared the oneness of us all and the gifts of us all coming from the Spirit and sharing in the life of the Spirit and giving rise to that Spirit in each and every person, not only in my colleague, but also in the congregation. The Spirit that is between us and among us and in us, being allowed to give expression, full expression. That is my theology in a nutshell, really. This oneness, this interconnectedness of us all, and sharing your gifts for the good of all. That shines here. That shines here in this church. Pastor Red said, I learned years ago, both by experience and perhaps by inclination, that ministry really is ministry of the whole people of God, and that ministry really is a team undertaking from the get-go. They believe their role as an ordained pastor is to facilitate everybody's gifts. Pastor Brown said their training was foundational, training that focused on facilitating and enabling others engaged in ministry. And Pastor Blue told me that their theology and their Christology was very similar to their teammates. From a liturgical perspective, my participants were unanimous in their conviction that it is very important for each member of the team to have a visible presence during the liturgy. In one church, the pastors generally alternated roles. If one preached, one presided, and vice versa. In the other church, one pastor had a more visible presence preaching than did the other, and the latter a more visible presence in other parts of the liturgy. One mentioned, though, that although pastoral care held a high priority for them, that they felt called to the ministry of the word, sacrament, and pastoral care, which is what they were ordained to. Another added the dynamic that when the team is all present during liturgy, they can play off one another and banter back and forth, bringing spontaneity, joy, and life to the liturgy. I also heard it expressed that they felt a variety of voices contributed to a more engaged congregation. As one pastor said, I think it's important for the congregation to hear a different voice and a different approach. I wouldn't want to listen to my preaching every Sunday, year in and year out. My participants were also unanimous in living out a pastoral identity that had everything to do with their church congregations, with the individuals in those congregations, and little, if anything, to do with the assigned functional responsibilities. Individual needs of the congregation members became the primary focus. Although Pastor Green's primary responsibility was pastoral care, they commented, I have no problem referring someone to my teammate or my teammate referring someone to me because we just feel the personalities might fit better. They went on to say, it's just, especially for funerals, it's whatever the needs of the person is, right? Whatever their wishes were, what their family needs. Pastor Blue echoed those same comments about funerals and told me hospital visitation followed that same pattern from a pastoral perspective. Whoever was the best fit. Turning to the challenges, my participants noted two things. The first, they quickly pointed out, was not unique to team ministry. Simply put, it's the challenge of competing personalities. On one hand, the challenge of the overinflated ego. On the other hand, the challenge of dealing with insecurities. The personal dynamics that are so important. As one pastor stated, team ministry is very difficult, and unless you have the right dynamics, it can be disastrous. I've seen it. And went on to tell me about their first experience in team ministry. The other person they'd been working with had never worked in a team environment before and was very insecure. Egos and jealousies got in the way, and it was quite obvious that this person felt threatened by my participants' presence. But what was particularly interesting to me, however, was the aha moment that my participant experienced. They said, after my former colleague left, people commented that they picked up on those things. I didn't think they were. I thought I was covering it very well because I always lifted my former colleague up in every way I could. The second major challenge that my participants raised was the potential for triangulation. I heard one of the things that I've discovered over the years that's difficult about teams is that some congregation members will identify with or be more drawn to different personalities. And so they might not like your teammate. You ever hear anybody complain about a pastor? And then as they explained, you're at risk of getting caught up in that. Another scenario, of course, is very reminiscent of family life. Does this sound familiar? Pastor Brown said, you know, one of the worst case scenarios is when you have those experiences of triangulation. When someone comes to me and has a concern about my teammate or vice versa. Or they come to one of us and don't get the satisfaction that they want, so they go to the other. I'd like to turn now to the last of my major themes. What makes a team ministry successful? My participants highlighted the importance of communication, but not just any communication. Communication that's open, that's honest, that's neither threatening nor critical of the other. In one church, communication was quite structured, with regularly scheduled meetings. In the other, it was less structured. But all of the participants recognized that keeping in touch, whether formally or informally, was absolutely critical. Maybe in a meeting, maybe a drop-in chat, or maybe a catching up in the hall, even emails or texts, but those only as a complement to face-to-face time. But as one pointed out, communication does not mean micromanaging. They said, I have no interest or need to look over my teammate's shoulder and every week bring them in and make them account for what they've been doing. I chose to present this next success factor as the last, not to diminish it in any way, but actually to raise it up as the bookend piece to that overall wonderful, delightful, amazing experience that my participants described. The success factor is attitude. I cannot state it any better than Pastor Red, who said, ultimately, what needs to be present for a good team to happen is there needs to be an attitude. There needs to be an awareness, an openness and awareness that ministry isn't about me. It's not about me shining. It's not even about me and my gifts. It's really about releasing the potential, the creativity, the gifts of everyone on the team. And the recognition that when that kind of creativity is released, that's when ministry happens at its very best. For when the team shines, we all shine. As I reflected upon my research, I observed that all my participants presented themselves as mature, confident, positive persons, very self-aware of what did and what did not work for them, and quite open to exploring ways to make their team ministry work. The personalities that I observed were neither the egocentric nor the insecure that they collectively suggested were challenges to team ministry. And I was told outright regarding triangulation that we just don't play that game. So for me, my participants, theirs was a good attitude. My research received insights that might be, or maybe even should be, of interest to the church. Berna says a major advantage to being led by a team is that the results almost always transcend what any individual from the team could have produced alone. Solo leadership, he says, can take you only so far as your individual capacity, which supports the earlier comment that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And while I've used Paul's imagery of a variety of spiritual gifts in the one body as a metaphor for ordained team ministry, the metaphor certainly extends beyond ordained team ministry. A recurrent message from my participants was that ministry was about the whole people of God, and teaming ought to be inclusive of all members of the body of Christ, not simply the ordained pastors. This is living out Barna's comment. This is something to be embraced. Now, let me introduce you to superpastor. More than likely, superpastor has been elevated to this superhero status by our churches, maybe by the church structures, but more likely by the congregations who feel that their pastor can and should be able to be all things to all people all of the time. The reluctant superpastor. But once that superhero cape is donned, there's a risk. H.B. London says that this walk-on-water syndrome triggers in a few pastors an obnoxious, pseudo-holy, prideful opinion of themselves. Stephen Parsons has gone on so far as to suggest that it might even trigger acquired situational narcissism. So there's a chance that superpastor might possibly morph into an egocentric superhero, a legend in their own eyes. But superpastor flies, no pun intended, in contradiction to verse 3 of Romans 12. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Just as the spiritual gifts given to one pastor are not greater than the spiritual gifts given to another pastor, the spiritual gifts given to pastors are not greater than the spiritual gifts given to other members of the church. But superpastor does exist, and it contradicts Paul's expansive imagery of the many spiritual gifts working together for the common good of the one body. Barna puts it this way: God's intent was to prepare each one of us to be a role player, not a superhero. Being elevated to superpastor may give someone an ego boost, but what it also does, what it mostly does, is it creates isolation. Isolation and loneliness. Loneliness possibly leading to anxiety, depression, burnout, and other manifestations of stress. The challenge that my research brought to the forefront for me is the need to shatter the image of superpastor, to once again fully embrace Paul's theological imagery. Team ministry as lived out by my participants shattered the construct of superpastor, most notably through the support it provided to their pastors, breathing life and excitement into their ministries, and reducing loneliness, stress, and burnout. But their lived experience in team ministry also did much to alter that default expectation of the congregations. Pastor Brown said, sharing in liturgy gave a balance and dynamic that modeled well for the congregation, and their healthy relationship also modeled well. All participants suggested that congregations supported them and cared for each of them. Team ministry provided congregants with a healthy alternative view to superpastor. The major learning from my case study fell into two areas for me. The first is in building the team that's charged with using their diverse spiritual gifts together to build up the body of Christ. As one of my participants said, it's like building a sports team. And how ideally, if you were starting out from scratch with a team, you'd look for complementary skills and personalities. But it's not that often that our churches will find themselves in a position where they can start from scratch, building up a brand new team. However, the experience of my participants revealed to me just how important the fit is. The common, or at least compatible, theologies and liturgical and pastoral identities, the compatible personalities, and building on complementary skills, passions, and interests. And my research revealed to me just how crucial attitude is. As one pastor put it, being mature and contented in their own skin. The challenge then becomes, how can churches address this in their hiring or their placement processes? But addressing it is something my participants would say is very important. The second area that the research highlighted for me is just how important a strong support system is. Crucial, actually, if churches are going to shatter that super pastor image. Churches, whether it be the local congregations or the corporate structures like the diocese, the conferences, the presbyteries, or whatever the correct terminology is in other denominations, they need to address that proactively. All of this, Pastor Brown said, is for the greater good, to build what Pastor Red referred to as collective energy and synergy. My research left me much to reflect on, and hopefully it left others much to reflect on as well. So it's been a pleasure to be able to share the results of my research with you. And I'd just like to say a couple of thank yous to my participants who so generously gave of their time and who shared so freely and honestly. To my advisors and consultants who mentored me and at times held my hand through the process. And to my church families who offered me such prayerful support, St. Thomas in Fall River and All Saints in Bedford. And last but not least, to my family, for their patience and understanding, and their love and support. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Now we'll team with the questions. Questions, comments? Whoa! That's a 1, 2, 3. There we go.
Thank you, Shirley. I didn't pick up any language or any sense at all that within these teams there was a hierarchy. You just didn't mention it. It maybe have been there, but I didn't get that at all. And yet you're about to enter service in a church where there is always a hierarchy. We lack, as far as I know, the concept of co-rectoring. There is a rector, there is a priest in charge, and there are assistants. So I don't know quite how to phrase this, but when you began talking there, I was really thinking, whoa, this is like Disney on Ice. You know, this is just all so wonderful. And yet we function in, we do not function at the moment with what I'm hearing here is, to borrow from our government service days, self-directed work teams. Mm-hmm. It seems to be what you were describing. And yet that's, I don't think, the structural reality of our church, so I wonder where that leaves you.
Okay. Thank you for your question, and I can't comment on that. It did come up in research, but it wasn't a primary theme in my research. In both of the churches, there was a hierarchical structure, but as one pastor pointed out to me, that was not what they focused on. They focused on a relational working together, not hierarchical. However, both of the individuals who were in, if you like, the top of the hierarchy in those churches made statements where they recognized at a point in time the buck stops here. And so they recognized that, yes, they had overall responsibility for that particular church, but that was, they didn't want to do it and you do this and you do this and put a thumb on or something. So there was a recognition of it. And in one of the churches, one of the pastors suggested that before they pursued anything that would be, if you like, an expansion of their ministry, or a new ministry, they would very certainly consult with their teammate because they felt that that was their responsibility to do that in recognition of the fact that the other person, the other teammate, in fact carried responsibility for that particular church. Yeah.
Michelle Bull here. Thank you. I was going to ask that question, but now I can ask my other question. I was wondering about the hiring process for these people. Was one of them hired first and the other added on, or how did that work?
In one church, both individuals basically came at the same time. In the other church, one of the team was already present when they hired the second person. The second person was, if you like, a replacement for someone who had retired. So it was two different situations.
Thanks, Shirley. Were your participants all Anglican?
No, they weren't. They were from two different denominations.
A very critical participant, or someone who witnessed this, would suggest that not having them all Anglican would either be on the basis that you assumed that the theology of ministry was the same across denominations, or that the theology of ministry wasn't crucial to processing the question. How would you respond to someone who suggested that?
I wanted to get, in my research, individual responses. It wasn't necessary for me to have them in one denomination or another. I chose two just in case something different popped up from the two different denominations. But I was interested in them as individuals and their vocational identities and how that played out. And so I didn't view it as essential to have them in the same denomination. It wasn't a study of Anglican ministry teams, per se. It was a study of how people lived out their vocational identity in teaming.
Thank you.
So there are teams that work really, really well, as you mentioned, and there are teams that are disastrous. And I think that I think you picked two teams that probably got along very well. What I'm curious about, though, is when you listed off the things that look like they made a successful team ministry, did you pick up on some of the things maybe that we should look for that would indicate it will not be a successful team ministry, or that there are people who, in fact, are not built at all for team ministry?
So when I selected the teams, it was on the advice of, I had a list of potential teams. I didn't do any screening of the teams beforehand to say, oh, that's a good team, or oh, that's a bad team. There was none of that. I was looking for the individuals. So in terms of things that don't work, what they were talking about was the fit, the personalities, and their styles. One of the pastors I interviewed was talking, it was about liturgy that we were talking about, and how important it was to them to be able to live out the full, their full vows of ordination, of ministry of the word and the sacraments and pastoral care, the full meal deal, not just I'm only going to do this part here, or I'm only going to do that part there. So we had some discussions about that. So that's knowing that with your teammate is, trying to figure out, are their liturgical identities compatible? Is the fit going to work? What are their personalities like? So that was the big thing that came out in terms of making the team successful, was how are they going to be able to work together? So it came down to personalities was a big one, and attitude,
Hi, Shirley. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned some of the challenges, and one being personalities, and I'm wondering in your research whether there was any discussion about how they worked through the conflict of that, and whether there were healthy practices for working through the conflict of different personalities.
In one church, one of my participants had made the comment that I don't believe my teammate and I have ever had a disagreement. Okay? They said our Christology and our theology is compatible. You know, that participant respected the authority of their teammate by virtue, that was, if you like, the lead minister or the rector or that position. In the other church, there was an instance that one of the pastors had discussed with me, and again, it came back to something to do with liturgy and how they would like to do this or they would like to do that. And so they basically brought it to the other teammate, and they had a discussion of it, and they worked out that, well, yeah, this should happen. And so they worked it together. And then there was another instance that they referred to where it was something that they just basically agreed to kind of disagree, right? And it was something, it was about selecting hymns. The difference between, you know, maybe the old hymns and the more contemporary hymns and stuff like that. And so they just had a little difference of opinion on it. And so what happened is they explored another avenue to be able to offer both sets of hymns. So that worked really well for the people involved. So they came up with a way to work through it in a very positive way, not in an antagonistic way at all.
Hi, Shirley.
Oh, hi.
Thanks for the presentation.
Couldn't see where the mic was.
I remember some time ago, I was talking to someone who'd served as a warden, a lay leader in her parish. And she'd left that position. She was somewhat disappointed because when she went into it, she thought that she would be in more of a team environment with the rector of the parish and was looking forward to that experience. Found that that didn't really happen. Now, I can think of some reasons why that might be. It might have been the lay clergy thing, or it might have been that here was someone who couldn't be brought in on such a kind of level of confidentiality or something like that. But it's also the reality that most of our parishes can't afford to pay more than one clergy, if that, or are working with a team where there's someone who, rather than working 50% of the time, is an associate priest with 10 hours a week or something like that. It may be beyond the scope of your research, but can you see how your findings could expand into building different kinds of teams in a church, clergy and lay together?
I've been thinking about that, Nicole. Thank you for the question. Because I'm very well aware of the financial pressures that face all of our churches in terms of trying to afford full-time clergy and keep buildings operating and do all the stuff like that. And so I've been thinking about that, and I think, and I can only speak, I guess, from the Anglican perspective, because that's the system I would have more familiarity with. But I've been thinking about, you know, maybe there are different ways to employ teaming within the diocese. Maybe there are ways to do teaming on a regional basis, for example, where, you know, not one parish is bearing the cost, if you like, of a second clergy, but maybe it's something that can be borne by the region, and that there could be areas building on this idea of pursuing strengths and interests and passions, that there may be someone who can be, I don't want to use the word specialist, but someone who has a passion for education programs or something like that, who could do something regionally. And so that's teaming. It's working on the strengths and building on the strengths in that particular region. And so maybe that's something that could be considered. You know, I deliberately did not choose to go down the road to explore team ministry where in the Anglican tradition we would be having an associate priest and a rector. For those of you who don't understand that terminology, an associate priest, a community of associate parish priests, would be an individual who is, help me out, Bishop, if I mess this up, who will be ordained a priest and licensed, if you like, to that particular parish to assist the rector in the duties of that parish. And normally, not always, but normally associate priests may still be working or working part-time. And so their involvement is perhaps limited to the 10, 15 hours a week. And although we have an education program that associate priests would follow, it wouldn't be as extensive as a Master of Divinity. So I chose to, as I have a Master, or hopefully we'll have a Master of Divinity in another couple of months, and because I was interested in team ministry, I wanted to sort of narrow my focus to see how people with similar backgrounds, educational backgrounds, working in team ministry, how they experienced it. So I was deliberate in how I chose my sampling. But associate priests are an excellent example of teaming. But again, you know, parishes raise up associate parish priests, and you have to be careful. One of my participants had some extensive experience in working in situations, helping others to fill vacancies within their churches. And the comment was made that it's a completely different thing when you're building a team from scratch and when you are taking on someone else's team, the someone who has left, and all of a sudden you come in and you inherit a team. And how's that going to work? We didn't explore that questioning any further than that, but the point was raised that it's a whole different ballgame when you can build it and when you inherit it. But again, going back to a comment that I made with the fit and the placement options, I mean, I think churches need to be cognizant of that. The corporate church needs to be cognizant of that, and the people going into it need to be cognizant of it as well. I don't know if that answered you, Nicole, hopefully.
Thank you
Hi,
very
Carol.
much for a very interesting presentation. You and I took the same course 2 summers ago.
Yep.
It was in pastoral care.
Yes.
And one of the things we did was interview in all different combinations.
Yep.
And I thought of that as you were speaking, because I think, you know, sort of people coming together to form a team, personalities aren't rigid. You know, they're not ossified. They're not sort of, it's like a jigsaw puzzle where, you know, you've got to sort of get the right piece. We're continuously changing and hopefully growing ourselves. I recall one particularly awkward interview where I was role-playing I was going to say the patient, but the client. And I have to say I felt for the person who was interviewing me, but it was a transformational interview which actually helped me to go on to work hard to get on with people that I perceived as having enormous egos. Prior to that, I would sort of, you know, walk in the other direction. But since then, so I just want to say that I think AST might be able to help at a more primordial level almost in terms of helping people to learn about themselves and about their own personalities and about learning to get on with a wider range of personalities they might not particularly be drawn to. And I just want to say one more thing since then. That was 2 summers ago. I've taken a course through the Canadian Medical Association leadership training, and it was Leadership Begins with Self-Awareness. As a mental health professional, I thought I knew quite a bit about myself. I was surprised how much I learned in that. It was an online course. And at the moment, I'm taking a course leading change, also with the Canadian Medical Association, which I think would be very appropriate for this kind of training as well. And last night, one of the people in the online class disclosed how painful it was being in her team situation. And the rest of the class just started, the board just lit up with all kinds of support, that sort of thing. So I guess my bottom line is that I don't see personalities as fixed. And I see your discussion, I mean, the way I've learned a lot from you today, and I think I've learned a lot in terms of teamwork generically. And I think that, you know, learning to work as part of an effective team, that could be applied right across the board with the lay people and, you know, sort of all different situations. Our denomination wouldn't let us do the team pastorate. Thank you.
Just in response to that, Carol, one of the things you had mentioned about maybe AST could help. So all of my participants, I said I observed that they were very mature, they were very confident, they were very positive, they had that energy going individually and collectively. They all came from a similar background. 2 of my participants are graduates of AST, the other 2 are not, but they have a similar theological training. So as you say, you and I shared a course a couple of years ago. So there is training that we do receive here through AST or whatever theological training that is received elsewhere, that I think puts us in touch with some of those issues that perhaps that's what informed or partly informed their sense of self and why they were able to work together well as a team, because they had that common background, that thought process of working through things. And
Thank you.
Hi, David.
Okay, no pressure for the final question. Well, thanks for your presentation. It lived up to its name for sure, teaming with possibilities. Jody had mentioned that this was, something you talked about a few years ago, because you possibly could see yourself in this role. So I would love to just hear how this process has shaped your perceptions of team ministry.
Wow. Close your ears, Trev. It has. I've reflected on it a fair bit, and I think I have a fair bit more reflection to do on it. I came in with a desire to work in teams, even though I've had lots of not great experience working in teams in a previous career, and I've had really great ones. But I loved working in teams. It gave me a super amount of energy, and I just liked working with the people and bouncing ideas back and forth and that kind of thing, okay? So, that was my initial draw, I think, into team ministry. But originally, I think I would say that I would have probably been approaching team ministry thinking that I would be, if you like, not a co-commander, but a second in command kind of thing, that it would be very hierarchical. And I'm not saying from an organizational perspective that it isn't, still have to be hierarchical, but yet I have a greater appreciation from this study of like a co-pastorate, but not organizationally, recognizing that the buck stops with the rector or the lead minister or whatever. But I think I have a greater appreciation for that, and the idea that my participants pursued their interests and passions and didn't feel the need to account particularly to one another, but yet sharing the important, the relevant things. And so I think that was a little shift for me. There wasn't particularly a shift liturgically or pastorally, but I think from the perspective of how to live out my theology. I think that's probably the thing that shifted a little bit for me with it.
Shirley, thank you so much. I'm sure, like many of you, I've been on teams that shouldn't use that term. Ever. No, it's a faux term. It's a wrong designation. Just a bunch of individuals kind of battling with each other. That's not a team, period. What Shirley did as a consummate researcher, as she pointed out earlier, she went out and she talked to people who are in team ministry and who happen to get along for a whole variety of reasons. And in the getting along, some extraordinary things come into view. The joy and exuberance, it's amazing, it's wonderful, it's life-giving. I get to do my passions. I don't feel like I have to be super priest or super pastor. I get to actually live life and live out my vocation with joy and vitality. I mean, that's incredible data. And she's right, and you're right. She could have inadvertently or by circumstance encountered people who didn't have those experiences. And that's worthy of study too. Because the language might be radically different. Soul depleting, humbling, debilitating, crippling. But that's what we do in research. And maybe a researcher wants to look at that because that's probably not something that's life-giving. What Shirley did in this, and it was beautiful to watch her as a researcher, she'd come back to class, right, class? And she'd go, this is the data I have, right? This is what I'm coming up with. And we're going, wow, this is really amazing. And you relay that on, that sense of amazement, that sense of joy, and the sense of possibility. And then the teaming in ministry is such a lovely pun, but one that works so effectively for you. Well done, Shirley. Thank you.